Ken Clark, who is actually the chairman of the first committee, as well as a great radio host, is controlling the mic. So, Ken, I'm going to recognize the person you give the mic to, but I trust you to be fair because you're just a fair kind of guy.
Yeah, I wouldn't go that far. I would ask simply that you keep your questions brief. We're going to try to get to as many as possible. So I'm going to start right over here.
Yeah, these are questions, not speeches.
These are questions, not speeches. I'll hold on to the mic.
Speeches. When you guys are talking about a balanced budget amendment as opposed to the debt issue that you, a lot of balanced budgets can be balanced, but what does it do about the remaining debt that's going to be there? How much of the balanced budget deals with actually trying to reduce the national debt and try to find ways of reducing future unfunded liabilities?
Anyone want to take that?
I've thought a lot about this because I think there's going to have to be a transition period to take care of the debt. The basic idea, the best idea that I've had, and by the way, this is a problem that would be posed on the floor of the convention, and the convention is going to construct a solution to it. But the best idea I have is this. The federal government owns an enormous number of assets. A good friend of Mark and I is a high-level oil man, and he says that the mineral rights on federal property is worth more than the entire $17 trillion debt that is currently recognized as a part of the debt. And so selling federal assets to American citizens and American companies would be one of the ways to do it. But the principle that I would advance is we cannot trust Congress to do this. I think there's going to have to be some kind of a state-based, basically, I think we put the federal government in receivership and have the states create a receivership committee of some kind and have authority over the federal assets and other factors so that we can get out of this mess. There's got to be an organized, systematic solution to get there, but that's the kind of detail that will be hammered out at the convention of the states.
I'd like to not necessarily have every panelist comment on every question unless they really, really think it's important.
And I want to get to as many people as
question?
possible, so
Yeah.
Who's next?
My question is, at our caucus, we came up with this resolution and to have the conference. Many people are afraid that having a convention is dangerous. So I'd like you to, someone on the panel, to address that so we can kind of sort of put that thing to bed.
You know, I thought the same thing 5 years ago. And I thought the same thing as a result of statements that were made mostly by liberal groups and liberal individuals during the 1960s and 70s as a way of defeating an amendment to overrule some Supreme Court decisions and also to prevent a balanced budget amendment. And as I got into it, I discovered that, in fact, this is not really a new procedure, that we have had something like 35 different conventions of the states, none of which, as pointed out, ran away. There are charges, there have been charges or claims that the Constitutional Convention ran away, and for reasons that you can read either on the Independence Institute website or on the Convention of States website, that is simply not true. The Founding Fathers did not, in fact, violate their honor or their commissions. So we have very good history. We've also got, and you can criticize the courts for a lot of things, but one thing you cannot take them to task for is the way that they have dealt with Article V decisions. They have generally enforced Article V in a good way. They have taken the position, and the Supreme Court has taken this position, that the history behind the conventions, the history behind the amendment process, is good constitutional law that governs us today. There are something like 6 different backups for protection against a convention doing the wrong thing. They include the fact that convention delegates or commissioners are selected by the state legislatures. They are instructed by the state legislatures. They can be recalled and removed if they violate their instructions. They are bound by the scope of the application. They are bound by the scope of the call. If for some reason there was some sort of mass insanity and they all decided to violate their solemn oath and solemn instructions and the call, then anything they came up with would not be a ratifiable proposal. It could be tied up in the courts from the time the from the time the Article V Convention adjourned until the crack of doom. I want you to compare that with the restraints we have on a runaway Congress. Our founders pledged everything to give us our freedom. They pledged their lives, their fortunes, and the sacred honor. They knew that if they lost the American Revolution, if they lost that cause for freedom, the best thing that would happen to them is that they'd be hanged. They might more likely be drawn and quartered. A very gruesome punishment I'll spare you the details of. They took that kind of risk. If they did that for us, we, for crying out loud, can hold a simple convention.
Ken, hey Ken, Rob, I want to add something to that, and I want to add the blunt political reality. Everything you said is obviously true, and it's really important. And in the end, if it all goes wrong, then whatever comes out of that convention, ratifiable or not, has to be ratified, right?
Which requires 38 state legislatures
states
to do so.
Now, I hear a lot of people say, well, you know, things are crazy out there. The media is crazy. The left is powerful. It organized. Lots of stuff that they're scared of, right? But I want you to just do the basic math. That means, more importantly, that 13 states can stop anything simply by not acting. They don't have to do anything. And not just 13 states. One house in each of 13 states can stop anything, right? One house in each of 13 states. Now, if you review the statistics about the conservative advantage in the 13 most conservative states in the United States of America, what you find is the self-identified conservative advantage ranges from 38% to 26.5% conservative advantage in those states. And by the way, that does not include Texas, South Carolina, and Kansas, not exactly bastions of liberalism, right? Can we stop anything in one house in 13 states? I would say to you, if we really genuinely believe, if you're sitting there in the audience and you genuinely believe that we cannot, I would suggest that you give up. I would suggest that you go home and that you cocoon with your family and you pray to the Lord for mercy in the dark days to come, because it's over. We've lost our country, and we have not lost our country. This is a fight that we can and we will win. Yeah.
Questions. Let's go over here.
I would like to suggest as a part of this that you incorporate some sort of an article that would identify that justices are restricted to judging the Constitution by its original intent. And in addition to that, I would like to suggest a dictionary as to what the meaning of every word was from the point of time that it became part of the Constitution, so that we no longer have to worry about what is a marriage, and we no longer have to worry about what the definition of the word is.
Thank you.
I guess that
Ken,
wasn't really a question. I'm going to go over here, and then I'm going to go to the back.
Ken. Also, I want to exercise moderator privilege right after you do this one.
Go ahead.
No. Go ahead.
I drove down here from Wyoming, and I saw this. I saw this online. I was at a Republican county caucus, and I got slapped down on this thing because everybody's afraid of a runaway convention. And anyhow, I guess my question is what is the exact wording of the request for a convention? How do you keep it, proposals germane to that wording? And then I guess that's the big thing that I'm interested in.
The wording of the application that basically the three of us wrote is online at conventionofstates.com. You can go see it. We are exercising, with the cooperation of our sponsors in the legislatures of the various states, very tight control over the operative language, so that unlike the balanced budget amendment, the various applications have been worded in different ways that may or may not cause litigation issues in the future. We want to avoid any litigation over the aggregation of that by making sure that the operative language is exactly the same in every state. And it is to call a convention limited to the purpose of imposing fiscal restraints on the federal government, limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and imposing term limits on federal officials and members of Congress. That's it. That language will be exactly the same in all 34 states. And so, what was the second part of your question?
Yeah, I just wanted to go to a place where I could see the wording.
It's
That's right on the
conventionofstates.com.
Yeah, and one thing about this wording is that it authorizes the convention to consider matters that would reduce the size and scope of the federal government. Proposals to, let's say, weaken the Bill of Rights, to damage the Second Amendment, would be utterly outside the convention's scope. The convention cannot consider those things. It can only consider those things that would reduce the size and scope of the federal government or impose term limits. The moderator's privilege that I'd like to exercise is for another gentleman who traveled a long way to be with us, all the way from Kalispell, Montana. Right, Tim? This is Tim Baldwin. Go ahead.
First of all, thank you, gentlemen, for your work in this area. I greatly appreciate what you're doing. Support it 100%. My question is trying to take the runaway, as it's so-called, sort of to the extreme. Let's assume it's true. Let's assume it happens. If you could explain the effect of delegates who would try to propose a new constitution for states to ratify, assuming there was a number that would be realistic. Let's just say they proposed that a new constitution would become effective if 10 states out of the 50 states ratified this new constitution. Assume it's a bad constitution. What is the legal or the political effect of what they're trying to do and our response to it?
Rob, you may. The effect is the same as what happened in 1787. Rhode Island and North Carolina didn't ratify the new Constitution. They weren't part of the Union. So we have to recognize that states are sovereign units of government. They're effectively operating in international law. The only way a government can become a member of a compact is by their own consent. No state could, without its consent, be coerced, no matter what number they said. No state without its consent could be coerced into joining some new compact. We all take leave of our senses. If California and Hawaii and Massachusetts want to go crazy and somehow pull this off and they put stuff in the Kool-Aid and poison all the delegates or something, it's going to require that kind of fancy scene to get there. But assuming they do it, let them try to run a country with just 3 or 4 states. It isn't going to happen. I mean, there are so many checks and balances against this that it's incredible for them to even think about it.
Yeah, Tim, the Convention for Proposing Amendments is a creature of the Constitution. It gets its power from the Constitution. And one of the reasons it was put into the Constitution was so we did not have to have another constitutional convention. We didn't have to start all anew. James Madison drew the distinction this way. He said, a convention for proposing amendments is a convention under the forms of the Constitution, subject to those rules, as opposed to what he called a plenipotentiary convention, which is a complete constitutional convention that you start, that you create anew. The difference is revolutionary. The difference is, as Laurie Sain said, between revolution and restoration. We're not in the business of revolution. We're the business of restoration. Yes, Bob?
I want to add just one thing to that. The states as sovereigns don't need the Constitution's permission to call an actual plenipotentiary constitutional convention. That is something they can do by themselves as sovereigns. The only reason to invoke Article V is to self-limit to the Assembly's name, which I always like to remind people is a convention for proposing amendments. That's what it is, that's what it does. It is not, and I would say that probably 90% of the misunderstandings that come from this topic come from a simple use of the wrong term.
And that is the term given by the Constitution. It is a convention for proposing amendments. That's the official term.
We're back here.
Ken,
Bob, we're
here's
back
your
here.
next person.
My name's Oren Schmidt from Lakewood.
Yeah.
A lot of the proposals certainly are very popular with smaller states because it kind of is an end run around larger states with larger amounts of influence. But the Connecticut Compromise, which gave us the House and the Senate, was kind of that striking a balance between the small states and the large states. Why would large states want to buy into this, and how would you bring them to the table and not get them to walk away straight away? Because almost everything I've heard would undermine their influence and power.
I'd like to take a crack at that, and then
Sure.
Anyone else who wishes as well. As you correctly point out, the Connecticut Compromise tried to balance the interests of the big states and the small states, and that same process went on throughout the Constitution, including Article V. There are two methods of proposing amendments. One is for Congress to propose amendments, and Congress primarily represents population, not exclusively, but mostly represents population. The other method was the state-based method. Madison would have said the first one is national and the other one is federal. So it gives both mechanisms, both the principle of equality and the principle of population, the right to propose. You are right that any successful proposal is going to have to get a fair number of the large states to buy on. You cannot have a convention unless you've got 34 states. Yet, the large states are increasingly buying on to that. Within the last 2 or 3 months, we've had 2 large states, Ohio and Michigan, pass legislation, pass applications for a convention for proposing amendments. So people in large states are Americans too, and they realize that we have a problem, and we have to do something about it. The ratification process requires the approval of 38 states. That makes it almost impossible for any constitutional amendment to pass that does not have the supermajority approval of the American people. But some of the issues we're talking about right now are so popular among the general population: balanced budget, single subject rule, reining in Congress on surveillance, that there really is that kind of supermajority support. Not everything we talked about, but many of the things that we've talked about. And once this movement, as this movement gains traction, some folks in Washington, D.C. are going to be surprised to find out just how unpopular they are and how popular reform is.
The thing that I would want to just add to that is some of the mechanics sometimes get misunderstood. Once 34 states apply, all 50 states get to come to the convention. If one state decides they don't want to be there, they don't have to be there. They can go away. And it would still be a simple majority vote. If only 2 states were still there and everybody took leave of their senses, there's no quorum rule or anything like that. It's just, it won't happen. But nonetheless, walking away does no good. The convention goes forward. At the end of the line, you have to have 38 states ratify. Now, there's some states that are large states that are really pretty conservative, Texas being one of them. Florida being a pretty conservative state right now as well, and that's a large state. And so if you think of where the liberal states are, if you will, New England is dominant. And those are mostly pretty small states, geographically and population. They do not have huge congressional delegations for the most part. And so it's not a simple large state, small state thing as we might think. It's a little more complex than that. So,
Well, and the first state to pass was Georgia, which by population is the 9th largest
Yeah,
state in the United States.
that's right.
And there's great movement in Texas, obviously not a small state either.
We've got about 4 more minutes for questions. I'd like to move to another one. Who's got the mic?
Gentlemen, you've addressed some of our big issues with the runaway Congress and a runaway executive branch. You've also touched upon one of my major concerns, which is a runaway judicial branch. And although you talked about ways to kind of handle the front end with the appointments, I would like to ask you if you would consider any means of dealing with holding accountable our judicial branch short of the almost never used approach of impeachment. Something like a hyped up retention vote like we have in the state of Colorado or other states, some way to hold accountable those justices or judges who exceed their authority once they're already in office. Thanks.
Yeah, first of all, if they're only there for 8 years, it's not as big a problem as we have today. And if the states are appointing them, it's also not as big a problem as we have today. One thought that I've had that goes to a gentleman's question over here about original intent analysis, I think it would be appropriate to add a grounds for impeachment for a federal judge if they're interpreting the Constitution by some method other than the original meaning of the Constitution. And so, but we need to have effective checks and balances. One of the beauties of this whole process, if we take this step in this direction, it will scare Washington, D.C. to death for a long, long time. And even if we don't get everything correct right now, first of all, we validated the process, and we can use it again in the future if we need to. But I think we're going to get something like a 50 to 75-year honeymoon where they're going to be shaking in their boots, trying to protect their own backsides, trying to keep their nose clean. And I think really good things will come if we make some strides, even if we don't get everything absolutely perfect.
You know, in talking about your term limit proposal, for Supreme Court justices, you made the comment that this would change the situation where all the judges are from a few law schools.
Yeah.
You know, we have 9 justices on the Supreme Court. You know, every single one of them attended college at Harvard or Yale, attended law school at Harvard or Yale. All but one, Justice Ginsburg, had a degree from Harvard or Yale. Ginsburg has hers from Columbia, but she attended Harvard. If you don't think we're well along the road to aristocracy, what the founders feared, just ponder that statistic. Every single judge educated at one of 2 elite, very liberal law schools. One last question. Ken?
My question centers around the mechanics of it. If you have 50 states go to the convention, does each state, which delegate to their commissioners what they want on the convention, does that mean that each state is autonomous and would gather and then hash it out to come up with a 38-state majority? Or does that mean that we are somewhat aligned before we get to the convention?
You have to have 34 states agree on the agenda. The applications have to be essentially the same. There have been 400 applications in the history of the Republic, and we've never had a convention because there's never been 2/3 of the states agree on the same topic. And so, you know, the balanced budget amendment, if it gets to 34, there's going to be litigation on the aggregation rule. And because they've been written quite a bit differently. For example, the one that's pending in Oklahoma this year was balance in the budget by reducing spending rather than by raising taxes. Well, that little variance of wording can be argued to not be subject to aggregation. So we're not going to have that with the Convention of the States application because we're going to have absolute uniformity of the operative language. And so you know, that's the mechanical protection that we think is going to be the most important. I think the BBA people should win in litigation, but it'll be serious litigation.
Ken, did you want to say something?
No, we just have a lot of people that want questions. If there's a naysayer in the room, I'd like to get their question. So if we do have one, Rob,
Okay.
how much time
I do have a little
left?
bit of time because people have been sitting for a very long time. So let's
Right.
just say 2 more questions.
2 more questions. I'll go to this one, and then I'm going to go to the other side of the room.
Hi, my name is Dan. I'm from Denver, Colorado. I just like to say I love America. I love American society. I love that we are pluralistic. We like to look at both sides of things. Conventionofthestates.com and another website, jbs.org, to round out our experience. I have a question. What exactly are the limits that can be placed on an Article V convention? What's called? I mean, concrete. Can you tell me what 5 concrete things can you tell me? You know, bullet points are right there. Not it's safe. It can't. What 5 things can you tell me that will keep it from becoming a runaway convention?
Go ahead, Rob. No, you do.
Well, we have 300 years of convention law, convention practices, and also confirmation of those sorts of practices by the courts. And what limits, the way to think about a convention is it's a diplomatic meeting of the states. It's like the Geneva Convention, you know, where a group of sovereignties get together and they negotiate. Now, they're first limited by the scope of the job they're given. In other words, if they're told to talk about term limits, they don't have power to talk about balanced budget amendment. So that's one limitation. The second limitation is that they are limited by the instructions given from their bosses back home. Each state legislature designates its commissioners. Those commissioners are empowered by a document called a commission, which limits their power, and they're also given ancillary instructions, and those instructions can be reinforced back home. Some states, even Indiana is notable, have even passed legislation saying if somebody violates his oath and discusses something that's not within his commission or takes an action at the convention that is not within his commission, he can be prosecuted legally. Then in addition to that, the Congress has to take any validly proposed amendment and decide on a mode of ratification. That is to say, Congress has to decide whether this amendment is going to be sent to the state legislatures or to state conventions for ratification. We've used both methods. Now, Congress is an institutional rival to the Convention for Proposing Amendments. Congress is not the friend of the Convention for Proposing Amendments. And so if there's a colorable basis for saying, hey, look, this is outside the convention's power, we're not going to designate a mode of ratification, there's a good chance that Congress will do that. That may very well end up in the courts, of course. If by some miracle the Congress nevertheless decided, well, we really like this amendment even though it's outside the convention power, and they then decide to send it to the states, you've just listened to Mark Meckler give you the math, you know? You've got you need 30 states to approve. If the legislature is the entity that's going to either approve or disapprove, as has been the case for almost all amendments, one house of the legislature can block that. You ask yourself, what really is the likelihood of the legislatures, 38 legislatures or even 38 conventions, approving amendments that they don't want, they didn't send their people to the convention to approve? I mean, what really is the likelihood of that? I think essentially 0. And then, of course, any invalidly approved amendment can be disregarded by the courts, any state, any agency. Those people who oppose a convention for their reasons often offer the possibility of state nullification as an alternative. Well, state nullification is arguable constitutionally and certainly impractical because there's just too much stuff to nullify. But let me suggest that if you did have an amendment that was not valid, not only would no state have to ratify it, but any state could freely nullify it. So again, check after check after check, backup after backup after backup. You're talking about a risk here that approaches zero. If we can't take that kind of insignificant risk, then we're not really worthy of the liberty that the founders bequeathed to us. Rob, I'm sorry for the length of the answer, but
Do we
one
have
more.
time? One more. This will be the last
One more. This is it.
This will be pretty quick. My name is Cindy Lyons. I'm with Common Sense News. And one of the ways that I learn, and many people that I know learn, is by debate. So I'm asking Michael Ferris if he's willing, and Nadelson, if you guys are willing to debate perhaps Chris N. Hall or Publius Hulda, or maybe even Richard D. Fry in a debate, because that's how, when I see the debate back and forth, you know, one idea, then maybe, you know, you shoot it down, versus just one panel, one side. As journalists, I have to go for both sides to find out the truth. And,
well, I've debated a young man lawyer from Washington State, from the Evergreen Foundation, in front of the National Council for National Policy. I think that's on the web that you can watch that.
It's not live.
And so last week I debated 2 local members of the John Birch Society in Oklahoma. I thought I was walking into a debate with the president of the John Birch Society, but for reasons I don't really understand, he didn't show up. There's a discussion of me debating one of Phyllis Schlafly's sons from Eagle Forum. I'm willing to do that. If Chris Ann Hall wants to debate, fine. I will not debate Publius Hulda. I don't debate anonymous bloggers. If she wants to say who she really is, if she doesn't have the courage of her convictions to stand up and tell us who she is, I'm not going to debate her.
You know, speaking for myself, someone was on the radio the other day and said, well, you know, Nadelson won't debate. Well, I said, where has this person been?
Yeah.
You know, I started appearing on national forums in debate-type settings in 2010. It began in 2010 in Lansing, Michigan, and I've done it all over the country. Radio debates as well, webcast type fora. Look, folks, there comes a time when it's time to stop fiddling while America burns.
That's right.
Woo! Yes.